context, actually.
Politics.
Murdad, can I reveal a confidence? Do you mind?
Well, yes, by all means.
We're a god.
I'm going to do it anyway. I'm on the board of 30 Bird, and Murdad, when he was planning this conference, he said to me, "We can't think of a name. We can't think of a name for this. How can we kind of get a name or a phrase that encapsulates everything?" And of course, Junctures is the final name that was kind of mediated upon. But there was an earlier version, wasn't there, Murdad? Which was can I say it? Centrifuge. Was that the word? Centrifuge.
Yes.
I've got him to admit it, and I think that, and we both giggled, didn't we, when he said it? And of course, Murdad giggled in his wonderful Murdadian way. Centrifuge, that'd be a great name for this, but I don't think we'll get away with it. Could I say? Because I think it is context. I think, the centrifuge, obviously he was thinking about the centrifuges that do or do not exist in the nuclear, civilian nuclear program in Iran and so on and so forth, but centrifuge also being something that touches on the question of science, I suppose, and all those kind of things, and the mixing and the whatever. So I thought it was quite a good title, but I said to him, no, you probably won't ever get away with that. Well, but context is everything, because I think the thing is, what I find interesting is that there were one of our friends from Tehran said today, he said, oh, you talked about the truth, but then he said, oh no, a reality. And I wondered why he said truth, and then he said reality. And if I'm guessing, I think it's because he understood that truth is a very malleable thing. And maybe reality is something much more significant. And it's true, isn't it? Because, I mean, I don't know, is Iran still a part of the axis of evil, or...
Yes.
Or it is? It is? Okay, that's not been dropped yet. So it's the axis of evil, but it's also our friends who are happy to help us out against ISIS in Iran at the same time.
It's actually the point of evil, because I think North Korea and Iraq are not on the axis anymore.
Sorry, who? Oh,
I
okay.
think we are the evil.
Oh, you're the crucible.
We're just evil, were we?
You're just evil.
I'm going to use a sound effect to impose myself. No, but there's a concept. Sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat. There's a concept in psychoanalysis called subject supposed to know, and this is the concept where a patient is suffering from all sorts of neurotic symptoms, and so they go to a psychoanalyst in the hope that the psychoanalyst will help them find a cure. The assumption is that the psychoanalyst has that body of knowledge, whereby through their tricks or techniques or what you want to call them, they will be able to guide the patient in the right direction, and hopefully that patient will eventually get rid of their symptoms or their problems or their neurosis, and so be rid of their problems. In Lacanian analysis, which is kind of Freudian analysis, the analyst is trained to, if you like, completely demystify the patient. There is no subject that knows. So the responses that the analyst gives to the patient, always looking for an answer, always looking for some clarity, is to actually create a void. So they fall down. Obviously, they do it in a way which they don't fall down too hard, because if that might mean they were not going to come back, and then the psychoanalyst will have to look for another career. But nevertheless, I think this is really important. When we're talking about for example, what Orkita was saying, the space in between, people sometimes, and I think it was kind of mentioned here earlier, confuse this with, so we're going to create some wonderfully abstract, avant-garde piece of work which only the very few intellectuals are going to, understand. That's not the case at all. In fact, something that always really irritates me is, for example, theatre audiences who come in, they're brainwashed to see and hear and look in certain ways. And when they come across something that's unfamiliar, they can't get it. In fact, the very well-educated, the very well-brainwashed audiences of theatre, and I don't mean everybody in the theatre, but a lot of them, right, are in a way acting very stupidly. Going back to what Danny was saying, what he said, stupid people en masse. We just give a quick anecdote. We did a project a few years ago called Plastic, and there was lots of installations. And in one of the rooms in this brewery in Edinburgh, there were pickle jars. A sex change operation was the theme, so pickles obviously connect, in terms of preservation and all that. In these pickle jars, we put some stilettos, women's shoes. Women's shoes in pickle jars as people came and went. So imagine what it's like. Later, when this project was done, we sent it somewhere to create a video, a DVD of it, and then the chap from the shop called me, said, Mr. Saif, your video is all ready, and then said, by the way, I just wanted to tell you that, those shoes in those jars that we saw, yeah? Because my daughter and I watched this, and I think these are body organs in there. Just wanted to let you know, okay? But they're ready. Can you collect them tomorrow if you come? Now, we had that response. We had also a response from a chemist who came to see this and came up with the most fascinating, detailed scientific interpretation of what she thought this was. These two responses are very different. The point is that if we create a work which kind of enables the people who see it or experience it to actually have their own interpretations, you'll be surprised, I think, how intelligent those interpretations are, whether they are terribly well educated or whether they know nothing about it. And that is where, if you like, the interdisciplinary for me, or intersectorial, what the term is, comes in, which the in-between, the difficult moment, the moment we don't know. So yeah, just throw that in.
Can we have our moment in between now? Do I need a vote? Do we? This is about democracy. Are we happy for our moment in between and to help ourselves?
Oh, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the notion of democracy, we have a collective decision about whether we have paused enough to continue our conversation. A number of people have already continued the conversation, which is fabulous, but it does require everyone else not seated at the long table to be quiet. So if you want to continue the conversation, then let's do so. But can I just ask that we do respect the etiquette and the long table conversation? Thank you.
I would caution you, because the word technology itself, logos the word, and therefore often translated as a discourse upon something.
Yeah.
So technology, the term Ars Magna, the great art, was a
Can't hear you
book.
very well, sorry.
It was actually a book. And again, if you look up the OED, you'll find you can have a technology of grammar, and it's simply a discourse about a technique.
This is how it's coded, but it's not.
Can't hear you over here.
No, but this is again. I sometimes say, oh goodness gracious, oh goodness gracious, because I was just about to say what I sometimes provoke people with. I'm a nerd as far as the history of words go, and the concepts behind the words are more difficult to get at. You can have the word and the etymology and all the rest of it, but actually get to what was in people's head with this word is something else. But there's almost, I think, and I'm not a historian of linguistics or philology, but I think there's almost, through history, an almost inevitable degradation of language. And if we just stick with English, the thing is we add mixed, from Old English we add mixed Anglo-Saxon, the Latin, the Greek, and on it goes the French with the Norman French invasion and so on. So we've got so many words around, but also people in each generation redefine the words for themselves. And so there's just a plethora. I mean, it's almost as if we're going to explode in a cloud of meaninglessness. And maybe that's the kind of Zen attitude we should take towards things. I don't know. But, so I am a nerd about words, but as I say, the Oxford English Dictionary, you take 14 main headings under art, 7 under science, with all this other things. If you take 2, the appropriate pairs, in one case they're synonyms, and in the other case they're antonyms. They are amongst, I think, the most highly polysemous words, or polysemic as it words, in the English language. But that's where I find it absolutely fascinating to go on beyond the English to
Wissenschaft.
I mean, Wissenschaft in German, of course, is very tricky for us because you can add it to anything. Staatswissenschaft, Kunstwissenschaft, you know. It just goes on and on. Anything Wissenschaft, really.
Why are you looking at me?
And that carried over into the Russian to now.
But it's the same with science, so it's not different from science. If you use science. Wissenschaft is the same.
Well, it can be. It can be. But then, there's so many things I want to pick up on. If we go over to the social sciences, which you were referencing Orchidea and stuff, because that's for many people out of science that are they scientific? Mehrdad knows I have this, and somebody else I was talking to, Javad, we were talking about whether Freud was psychoanalysis was scientific. We know, but the nice thing to bring it back to things Persian. We've just been talking about Syed Hussein Nasser and his outlook on the history of science. And Borjadi, the book, starts with Said and but I'm thinking of Ziauddin Sardar, who of course is Pakistani, British Pakistani, and the whole thing with Thomas Kuhn that was raised, because that's the origin of this notion of the science wars.
Revolution.
Sorry?
Revolutions.
Well, the science wars is a phrase, and it is between these people that argue that science is socially constructed, and that brings up the whole political thing, as opposed to some others that honestly believe that there is a real epistemological value to a certain way of inquiring of nature, putting it into the rack, if you will, and testing it out in the lab and seeing whether it concurs with your hypothesis or not. But goodness gracious, shut up. I'm getting lost.
Could I pick up on that thing of degradation, the idea of languages getting degraded over time? That's a metaphor that I tend not to trust, because I think it implies he says banging the same drum he was banging on the Pechacucci early this morning, but I think it implies a moment of full communication that used to exist that we've fallen from. And I don't think that the idea of a language degrading is if we rewind it, there was a point at which...
Oh, but you're extrapolating to some perfect...
and I think
I'm not saying where it started. It's probably a mess in the first place. It's just got messy.
Well, no, indeed. I mean, that's where it began from. I suppose I like, as soon as I had my food, I was like, right, I want to go sit down. I'm like, do you know what I mean? I feel like I behaved myself for a bit and sat down. But yeah, there's a couple of things I wanted to say in terms of, I think there's some relationships are being set up that I'd want to play with and say maybe those aren't the right things to be comparing to each other as kind of inalienably opposite to each other. So I was thinking about, we were just talking to someone in the dinner queue when we were talking about the idea of yourself, and we were talking about, I was saying, like, is there, when we're like making, in the rehearsal room when we're making theatre, there's this thing, I think it's probably quite English. I'm not sure if other theatre makers from other countries do it. But there's this thing about a pressure to stop talking about and do. Do you know, like there's that old cliche and that's about like, look, you talk about it when you're not comfortable yet, you talk about when you don't have the bravery to go forward and stuff. And so then to flip that on its head, there's a way that what you're describing there is you actually start doing art when language stops, when everyday language stops. And I wonder if there's a similar thing that works with science, to the extent that I can, whatever that doing science is in the different disciplines, if that's about going like, well, there's a point with, let's say for the sake of argument, but we could sit here and have an argument about what kind of a thing an electron is, what colour is it, how, what blah, 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 blah. But at some point we have to stop doing that and start working something out, or we have to, point a machine at a smaller machine and measure things. Yeah. So that's the thing I want to say that, and then if
Can I just say something about that? Because I just want to keep going back to the politics of science and hierarchies of knowledge. And so there is theoretical physics and there is experimental physics. I think to say that one is more valuable and one is more vulgar, that implies, what you're saying implies that there's a hierarchy.
That's
Whereas,
a slightly silly turn of phrase rather than
It's those who think and those who sweat.
yes, so I think we need to be careful with that language.
I don't think that's a real division. You know,
It's a real division, but it doesn't. It's not. It shouldn't be a
To be
hierarchy.
fair, I don't really think electrons have any
it
turn
is a
of
real
colour
division.
either. Do you know what I mean? I was trying to give some silly examples. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Or should I say, I don't think that's a real hierarchy. It's just different things.
Exactly,
It is
exactly. But I
just
think
different things,
I think
and
the
it's
way
taken as such.
when we articulate it, we might turn it into a hierarchy, which is why I think language is really important.
I mean, that's, I think on that issue of that hierarchy, that is the age-old question, and that you know, thinking and sweating is that basic division, and we see it in terms of obviously gender, how that works, in terms of race, how that works. And I think one of the things that I think for me needs acknowledging in the discussion about intercultural work is that idea that we talk a lot about intercultural collaboration in the not in the abstract, but we talk about it in these grandiose terms. And there's that lovely line from Walter Benjamin that wherever the human in the abstract is raised up, the smell of real blood is never far away. And I think there's this. What needs to be acknowledged is there is an interculturality and an internationalism at the heart of this country that we sit in, but that's not an interculturality and a cutting across cultures and so on that comes out of a bunch of people deciding to get together and talk about things. That comes out of conquests, that comes out of economic displacement, that comes out of like terrible, actually huge human catastrophes and huge human historical moments. And I think there's a thing about, I try to acknowledge an internationalism from below and an internationalism of people that aren't kind of moving between countries consciously, but just in who they are. You know, the black and Asian working class in this country, increasing migration from Eastern Europe and stuff. That I wonder how, in these ways that we're talking about big overarching questions and whatnot, how that actual history of like lived experience of racism, of displacement and so on, oppression, how that cuts into these conversations.
Well, I mean, I'm going to put a contentious quote here from, he wrote a big article in the Mail on Sunday, the Nobel Prize-winning literature novelist V.S. Naipaul, and he was writing about Islamic State. And he made a very interesting point, which I think is a kind of shows the tension between what you're talking about, which is he talks about, I'll quote, it says, the expansion of the scientific inquiry coincided with or possibly caused the maritime expansion of European colonialism. Empirical science, the progress of liberal religion, and the germination of modern democratic ideas coincided with European colonial dominion over Asia and Africa. And that's a tension that I think makes history. It is, colonialism is not necessarily purely evil. It was not necessarily purely bad. It is about the tension that, you know, through scientific inquiry, there was a discovery of the new worlds and new knowledges, and new knowledge from other parts of the world and other continents. And I think, you know, that universalism rather than internationalism is very important. That kind of coheres as part of this provocation about, you know, where do we find the dialogue for that kind of common language. Kwame Anthony Appiah, in his book Cosmopolitan, talks about that. It's about universalism plus difference, and I think that's a kind of very key phrase, actually.
Yeah, I think the only problem with that
is really important.
Is one that I think it's not so much that colonialism was evil, or that its relationship with the Enlightenment was a coincidence. Its relationship between the two, in other words, the Enlightenment and colonialism. And also, you have to say, it's not that colonialism was a bad thing, it's what it prevented from happening. I mean, there's a great radical anthropologist, Franz Boas, in America, who, right at the beginning of the 20th century, said, the thing about, and he basically looked at how different cultures arise, and he said, the problem with European expansion across the world was that it stopped the development of societies in other places. That was actually a precondition of it. Right? In other words, it's not so much what it did, it's actually what we're missing in terms of human development. And of course, it set a template for human development, which was the West. Now, I don't believe, although I come from the West, I don't believe, actually, that that universalism is just the inheritance of the Western Enlightenment. I don't believe that for a moment. I don't believe, actually, there's one template for civilization. And actually, when you look at what's happening around the war on terror, actually what the West is trying to do yet again, through whatever ways and means it can, whether it's through soft power or hard power, it's trying again to railroad different civilizations along a particular route, in the thinking that this is the only way that civilization could advance. And to be honest, I don't believe that's true. If that's our starting point, and to be honest, interculturalism won't really mean very much, I don't think.
I like to also draw attention to, perhaps because Hassan, you mentioned, but was taking on the point you just said, but also because you mentioned centrifuge earlier on, to the idea that, to going back to this notion of nuclear industry in Iran, I don't want to talk about the politics of it at all, but what I want to mention is how, in some ways, and this is a conversation I was having with Mehriar, who probably knows more about it than I do, how, in some sense, if you like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mehriar, but it seems to that before the nuclear industry began to develop in Iran, there was experiments going on a small scale in scientific areas. Is that right, if I'm not mistaken? Now, so whatever was behind the nuclear drive and nuclear energy or not, what they did, they started actually investing in large-scale experimentation in order to achieve their nuclear ambitions, whatever they are. And what Mehriar was telling me, which is very interesting, was that as a consequence of that, suddenly through this, almost like an accident, through going through these sort of large-scale experimentations, they realized that they can begin to actually apply that to other areas and begin to actually experiment and invest and create the possibility for large-scale experimentation. I don't know if that's, you want to say something more?
Yeah, I mean, it was in material sciences, for instance, Iran's had a pharmaceutical industry going back to early 60s. For a lot of, and of course, its regulatory area has become very much closer and closer in terms of rules for the protection of its own population. And that has required the use of better technologies, for instance, non-reactive steel and all that sort of stuff, which it simply did not have before the nuclear industry really took off. They started, as a result of all of that, making special steel within Isfahan, and they used the special steel. Okay, they used it for the centrifuges, but also they used it for proper large reactors that they could actually make pharmaceuticals in. So these things, these sort of advances of science are not linear and also are not single purpose. And so that side of it should also not be forgotten. Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. So, with respect to why something like that arose, the principal reasons for the nuclear industry are actually nothing to do with aggression even if there is something developing or not, but it is a result of the alignments that happened in the Iran-Iraq war. It started from a defensive point of view, and then it went.
And that raises an interesting point in terms of going back to the notion of communication, perhaps in the provocation that was put to us. The difference between intention, of what we intend to actually communicate, what we intend to do, and what actually happens on the site as an accident, as a side issue.
It's a really interesting link, though, that I'm beginning to hear in our conversation around innovation experimentalism, traditions, the heritage that we carry, the stories, the way we tell our stories to one another. There's something interesting, I think, that's starting to join our conversation, if you like.
Well, they're all ways of representations. It's all about representation. I mean, science is a representational area, and art is, and literature is, and it's all about how we want to be in the world, or be seen in the world, in a way. I absolutely agree with that.
And also, I think, in response to that, I think it's the idea of the point of view and the purpose, and I think both in science and in the arts, whatever that means, there is that similar tension. So when we speak then about cultural perspectives, and yes, we can create that void space, that or kind of neutral or potential, whatever space that we were establishing before, but I think what is the shift that we need to bring to that space? Are we bringing our perspective and into that space, and we're asking that perspective to react to another perspective, or are we coming as a clean slate in trying to embrace something else? And how do we establish the rule of engagement? I think that's where a lot of the tension sometimes lies, and of course it's political, because we can't ignore reports of power, relationships of power, and historical relationships of power. So for as much as we can say, I was speaking earlier today with Hassan about post-migrant theatre in Germany, and there is this, I was explaining how there is this consciousness for a certain amount of people that work in the arts and are part of a certain establishment elite, that we live in a post-racial society. The reality is we do not live in a post-racial society. We can pretend, we can think, we can theorize, we can speculate, we can have a dinner as if we were in a post-racial society, but the reality is that outside that door, we do not live in a post-racial society. So how do we mitigate that tension, I think, is the question that I have. What work needs to be done by artists and scientists and writers and divulgators to address that difference?
Yeah, this is like, it reminds me of what you're saying, Omar. This sort of comment you hear, like you meet, you say statements like, oh, I have some gay friends, I have some black friends, which is kind of a thing. And I quite like to sort of invert that a little bit and say, I have some racist friends. And it's true, and they are friends, and they are racists. And that's the thing, that's interesting in a way. So picking on what you were saying, in the sense that there is a racist world, and we have to fight it to get rid of it, and then there's a post-racist world, or whatever, post-race world, which is then everything is fine, and we all understand each other is nice. But actually, it's much more interesting to have racist friends who quite happily, I was doing a show a few years ago with
I'd rather not have it,
Well, stick with it, Omar. He'll get there.
I will.
He'll get there.
It's a serious point. I'm not really joking. It's funny, I know. But yeah, but it's kind of, it's almost like, we were doing a show a few years ago, me and my friend and colleague Christoph Robolski, called Poland 3, Iran 2, which was about a football match. It was about the exodus of Poles to Iran. And he's from Essex. He's very tall, blonde, and I'm quite short. And so it was a comedy duo, really, without saying anything to begin with. But we got very close because we studied all this time, and we created this piece. And forgive me for saying so, but since we're talking racism, we ended up calling each other. So he would call me, and before I say this, you have to understand that the greatest source of racism in Iran is towards Arabs. For Iranians, Arabs, it's like the cliche, like Paki's here, for the English or whatever. So you call an Iranian an Arab, and you're in dangerous territory. So he used to call me dirty Arab, you know, in our conversation, and I used to call him an English cunt. Sorry, excuse me for that. But we were the best of friends, and of course he's not a racist, unlike anyone else. But what I'm trying to say, I suppose, on a serious point, is that it's much more possible to have an interesting engagement if these terms are used together, and that, rather than us trying to purify and cleanse.
Of course, but one thing is Merdad and Chris sitting in a room sharing a pint and calling each other dirty Arab and English cunt, and one thing is 2,000 people at the demonstration calling the other 2,000 people at the demonstration dirty Arabs or English cunts, because or shooting or whatever. I think what we do in our individuality, in our singularity with other people, is up to us, and we can control and bear the consequences of that. The moment in which we start to act in our singularity within the society, we need to communicate. I think this is what the question is about, is like, how do we find that territory in which we go like, okay, these are the rules of engagement. It's not about being politically correct. I understand your point. It's not about being politically correct. It's about understanding. It's about curiosity. It's about acceptance, and it's about then establishing a relationship which allows us to go beyond that definition. And then, you know, words can become words, can become sounds that come out of our vocal cords.
I was at, can't remember, about 6-8 months ago in Liverpool, and I was invited to speak as panel speakers on open borders, and I firmly believe in open borders. I completely, you know, it's an ideal to strive for, let's put it that way. And there was an artist, there was myself as an arts producer, and there was a local councillor and a sociologist, and all of us gave our perspective. All of us were pretty pro-immigration. There was no kind of, you know, anti-immigration sentiment. The public, which is not, it was not an arts public, it was local people of all kind of ages and class backgrounds, and it was very interesting because there were some UKIP supporters there in the audience, which was very good to see actually, because I didn't want to just speak to converted to the converted, and all of them were talking about why they're going to vote for UKIP. And you know, there were certain liberal lefts that were trying to shout them down and not let them speak. And I just said, look, let the guy speak. Let the guy speak. We need to kind of respect the freedom of speech and expression. And we had a very fascinating debate and discussion. And actually, you know, when we kind of put the counter arguments in a very civil, polite way, he came over and shook my hands and said, I'm going to rethink about who I'll consider voting for. And I think that is the power of debate and reason. And actually, you know, kind of accusing people of racism or casual racism, unless they're going to hit you with a kosh, you know, I think
accusing is something, talking about it is another. We can still talk about it while letting the other side talk.
Yes,
I think
but some people don't let the other side speak.
Well, that's bad.
I think let's be very clear though. I mean, like, probably the single greatest crime any human being has committed in terms of just the brutal weighing up of the bodies on the gruesome weighing scale of history is the Belgian colonisation of the Congo. You know, 10 million people killed in a couple of decades. Now, the King of Belgium didn't do that because he individually didn't like Congolese people. Do you know what I mean? He didn't have a problem with the Congolese people, the way their names sounded, what food they ate. He didn't specifically hate them. There was a sociological and a kind of political logic to what happened. So I think if we're talking about where we are in terms of race and racism and how that cuts through this kind of work, I think we really have to acknowledge that this isn't about trying to change the minds of individual people, whether even 2,000 people on a demonstration. Like, you know, for instance, you know, the Metropolitan Police may not individually be made up of racists, but they don't have to be. You know, they stop black and brown men 6 times more than they stop white men, and so on and so on and so on.
But even worse than that, I mean, I think these are the very obvious cases of racism. But to bring us back to the discussion about science and why these conversations are important and central even to science is that when eugenics was dominant, it wasn't out of evil intentions. Scientists genuinely believed that they were doing something good, and we all know how that went. So I think that to be aware of, no, but I mean it's a very important point in history of medicine, in bioethics discussions now, because I mean kids who go to medical school or study even history of science now, we all assume that people who were for eugenics were horrible people. But I think it's that kind of awareness about our, what we take for granted, and the context.
And of course, eugenics is only going to grow with the stuff that we know from the genome and the stuff and with early days of that.
But I think think about the experiments that were happening during, in the camps. They were not seen as bad as we might like to think about them.
But you're reminding me. And again, of sometimes when I get more serious about the question of relations between the arts and sciences and people actually acting between them. Because it seems to me, I mean, I do use the term art, and so there's an art to being a citizen, there's an art of statesmanship, there's an art of government and all the rest of it, and there's science that goes with those. It's a very broad use of the term, but if I went back to Joseph Beuys, it would be jeder Mensch ein Künstler, Everybody should aspire to be, an artist in the best sense of the term. But things like climate change, and so this is where you're bumping into who's doing the Cape Farewell connection. Somebody. Who was the Cape Farewell? I just had a wonderful conversation with her.
It's a bathroom.
Sorry?
Bathroom.
Oh, bathroom.
Let's talk really loudly, shall we?
Okay. Well, not to worry. But yes, I mean, this finding a common language, and in a sense I'm going to say something very trite. We today have found a common language, which is English. So it is the lingua franca. I mean, that's very trite, it's down to earth, but we communicate in this current day lingua franca, which isn't the bee's knees, and as I say, is possibly more degraded than many languages.
He's doing it again.
Well, I am, yes. No, I think English carries a lot of burdens, white men's burdens or something with it or something. I'm not quite sure how to frame this, but how much are we, a very middle-class, self-selecting group, talking about all this stuff? Whereas many of the issues that we are actually worried about, we would say were others than us.
Well,
I think we've consented to that. I think it's about our personal responsibility.
Yeah.
There's something about the imagination that we can bring with us.
Exactly. And I think there was, when you asked what can we do in order to bridge that divide, it was the first thing I thought. There's a power in imagining something else. There's a power in projecting something to other people. To kind of say, look, it is actually possible, even though we're using funny language and we're talking in tongues and all this business, but it is possible. So maybe it is just 20 years away or whatever, the post-racial. No, but things have happened in the past that people have imagined wouldn't happen. We're all voting.
Where does that? It's interesting. I think you're on the money. Where does that conversation need to take place, and where does that power? Because again, we're talking about politics and power. Where does that power need to come from, and what's the direction? Is it vertical, descending from high up, or is it rising from the bottom? Where, if these conversations happen in closed rooms between people who can have those conversations, or are entitled to have those conversations, or are safe in having those conversations, then how is it affecting the world of people who cannot have those conversations? I mean, we are here speaking about Iran, and until a few years ago, and still in the kind of Western psyche, Iran is perceived as a place where you don't have freedom of speech, where you can't do certain things, where people don't wear jeans or whatever. So I think it's really important to understand, to shift a bit the balance and say, yes, we can have these conversations. Yes, we can have a consciousness as people who share a language, who share certain values. But then there is all other world that lives on a different level, on different levels.
Sure.
And we need to be able to hear those voices as well. We need to be able to let those voices and culture express in a powerful way, not in just oh, here you go, this is your slot where you can do your little
But
thing.
That's a terribly emphasising thing, I think.
Isn't that the witnessing that art does? I mean, is that
Who's better placed than art and science to
witness?
reach out, to
But art
speak
and science
to?
should be also power. They're not only witnesses.
But no,
No,
look, there's social space too. I mean, let's, this self-selected thing of being middle class and whatever. Go to the pub, go to cafes, go and hang out in social spaces and speak to people. And that's where, it is about, that's what the idea of a cosmopolitan society is about. It's about actually not living in your own little enclave, but actually speaking to the world out there. And there's a really good kind of comedian, artist, performance artist called Hennessy Youngman, and he talks about relational aesthetics, does these lovely little YouTube lectures about conceptual art or performance art or relational aesthetics. And he said that artists who like to do social engagements basically do so because they've got no friends in the real world. And I thought that's really good. I'm kind of paraphrasing, he says it in a much more funny kind of hip-hop way. And I think that is true. Artists maybe just do not get out and about. I'm not talking about doing sort of participatory artwork. I mean, just going to speak to your neighbours and speaking to people and go to Wetherspoons and have a few pints with some people, and just kind of talk about stuff.
Some do. I think the artists celebrate.
The thing is that in terms of finding this sort of common language and finding debate and disagreement, it's really important.
But I don't want a common language. I actually want to have a language I don't understand and to get to know people and to try and understand it. And I think the more we strive towards a common language, the more we have McDonald's. I got really angry with a guy at a conference where a Turkish student, arts management student, in very faltering English, asked this Dutch guy at this conference, what could she do to improve her career in arts management? And this conference was going on in Tbilisi. It was being held in English. And this Dutch guy looked at this woman who'd struggled to get out her question and said, "Learn English." And I was horrified. I said, no, it's our job to learn Turkish, or at least to try and understand what she's saying. And to get that. And it is terrible to think that we're all going to end up with a common language that you understand. It's ludicrous to think that artists are the people that can do this. The vast majority of people outside this building have never come across art in their lives as far as they're concerned, and they live quite happily without it. They're far more interested in knowing how Cambridge United did last week than worrying about what the artists are going to say, and to say that we can solve the problems because artists understand humanity. No, we have a view, and that's our language, and we go out and we talk with that language to each other in gatherings like this, but it doesn't really impact on the real world, and it's not going to impact when we come together across cultural divides, if we try and get something that's in between and we can both understand it. I like the fact that they do things differently. I find it incredibly frustrating if I get a theatre company coming in and they don't understand how a theatre works here, and I've got to run by my rules. I find that frustrating, but I also find it bloody liberating that they don't bother with all those rules. Those are the things that matter. Those are the things that have an impact on me, and I really don't want a common language.
I think there's something interesting around kind of artists facilitating conversations with scientists, and with Arts Admin actually Lift is on a European network where we're focused on artists and scientists working together to promote or kind of talk about the issue of climate change. And there was a famous kind of show a couple of years ago by the scientist Stephen Emmett, who worked with Katie Mitchell, and we were having a conversation with him and sort of saying, oh, did this process of working with Katie Mitchell and thinking and putting your performance or putting your lecture into a theatre context, did that help you communicate your message? Thinking that art, is great at kind of communicating to a wider number of people. And actually then it turned out not necessarily, because he was delivering that to 100 people a night over 2 weeks, when normally he delivers, he delivers that talk to far larger numbers, and actually then has a debate, where in actual fact in the theatre context it was people watched and then heard him, and then there was no opportunity to have a kind of debate around that issue. So I think there's sometimes we think of ourselves, or the kind of, we're the best at kind of communicating, in actual fact I'm not sure if that's always the case, and also whether we can reach out to a wider number of people, and if art should solely be a communication tool to make things clearer to people, should it not kind of obscure and complicate the issue, rather than just getting this kind of, in this case, this climate change message, people must understand this.
Yes, and on that note, I'd like to tell a little story. I completely agree. I think that's a problem with communication, and that's why I was talking about the difference between intention, what are we trying to say, and what's actually happening. And so whatever happens beyond communication is always far more interesting. But again, going back to psychoanalysis, Lacan was very famous. I don't know if this story is true, but it's an event where basically you have what you call an obsessional neurotic whose way of existence is they want to go from A to B. I'm simplifying here. And so they go from A to here, to there, to there, to there, to there, back, forth, left, right, center, and just never quite get to B. So this patient was talking a lot, constantly going on and on and on, being very articulate, being extremely communicative. And anyway, the myth goes that Lacan just was there listening and said, I'm just going to make myself a cup of tea in the kitchen, but you carry on. And just basically left the room. And that was a kind of a metaphor for, if you like, how in some ways that way of communicating is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have anything interesting in it to say. One other story I'd like to tell in this context is, one concept I want to throw into this debate is the idea of ignorance and the value of ignorance. And people used to tell me, what you mean is not being aware or not being informed. And I said, no, I mean actually ignorance, not knowing and, taking risks, if you like, taking steps without knowing what you're doing exactly and where you're going. I think that, for me, is at the base of creativity. And then I would also like to throw another question in this. So we hear around this table, all of us, say we. I just said it. We hear we. Yeah. We this, we that, we that. We're very happy in putting ourselves in these categories. We, the middle class. We, the whatever. As if we don't stop to think. Again, I've used it again.
Well, yes.
What is meant by that? I'm going to use the passive tense to avoid that now. So I think that's important. That's important. There are. I think there's a danger of an assumed identity in that usage of language, which needs to be tackled, because in individual, if you like, traits or subjectivity is by definition extremely complicated and perhaps unique.
That's rather what I was trying to get at, actually, but I was speaking, but you've done it a lot better as far as this, as can we find a common language. So I was really questioning, whether this group that is assembled today in the junction, in Cambridge, is the we or whatever, or is it we generally, the arts community out there, the science community, and the rest of it. I would suggest on uncertainty and ignorance, the complexity science is the upcoming thing for this century. Wonderful little book by Dennis Noble at Oxford called The Musical Life, where he says, I've been a card-carrying reductionist all my life, but we now have the genome, and it is now our task to build up complexity. And he uses the metaphor of music and an orchestra to talk about that. But the point is that in complexity and decision-making, you're always hitting that boundary. If you don't know, you cannot know everything. And so that comes, I think, into the whole question of complexity science, which is
it's
coming thing.
being comfortable with the coexistence of different knowledge systems, right? That's what we're talking about. It's just having.
Okay, but I think it is ignorance or nescience, as Mélode is saying. I mean, it's actually not knowing, and knowing that you don't know.
No. It's it's accepting that somebody else knows the same thing slightly differently. And there is,
No,
you
I
know,
think-
in
are
evolutionary
you
world,
agreeing with the-
I think I see her
But
point.
it is. But I think it is slightly different. I mean,
No, I think it's
that's
important. I mean,
that's a valid
even
point.
if you think
yeah,
about
making a different point, yes.
No,
Not summarising it.
Yes, no.
Yeah.
But I think there are cases when you really don't know. It's not a matter of one
Yeah, that's
person's
one thing,
idea of knowing against somebody else's idea of knowing, or
But it's not just a matter of opinions or taste. It's I think what you're getting at is different knowledge systems, which is different ways of knowing and asking. And that, you know, maybe, I mean, I really like the idea of not having a common language, because that assumes that we need to arrive at a fixed entity, fixed subjectivity, but none of us, I mean, we will all be different tomorrow. And because subjectivity itself is always in the making, and language itself is in the making. But maybe the main question is the how-to of this, how to ask questions, how to be comfortable with other ways of knowing, or how to be comfortable with uncertainty. I mean, from the beginning of our discussion, I made this note here, uncertainty, be comfortable with uncertainty. And I think uncertainty is something that really, really scares us.
Yeah.
Yes, I
I took
like
a puppeteer to see a dress rehearsal of a show once. She didn't speak very good English, and this was a company local to me, and I took her to see a dress rehearsal of the show. It was a touring company, and it was at their base, which was an industrial unit, and this was set up a little mobile theatre there so they could do a dress rehearsal of the show. It wasn't very good. And at the end of it, in her faltering English, she really hit the nail on the head. She meant to say, "Where is this show going?" or something like that. And what she actually said was, "What's it for?" And I thought, absolutely, what the hell is this show for? It wasn't very good, it wasn't anything, and it was going to go and torture rural villagers going on in their village. What's it for? And by her lack of English, she hit the nail on the head for me.
I don't want to torture us any longer as we're being tempted by Saba's fabulous desserts.
they're very festive and menthol. It relieves the
There is
acting.
also a complimentary drink in the foyer. Can I make a suggestion that we move into the foyer with our dessert and then continue the conversation in an informal manner from here on? Before we do that, I would like to just, with a very heartfelt thank you to everyone who participated and attended today. I am touched by everyone's commitment and passion, and I am very delighted to have everyone.
Thank you for arranging it for us.
And thanks to the wonderful chefs. Fantastic food.
Hi, Jenny. Look at you. Come round. Come round.
Say hi.
Yeah. We know what this is.